Kansas City has a real deal, old school mob family, the Cosa Nostra family, Sicilian based, have the making ceremony, the whole 9 yards, have made men, have associates. They're not very big, so it's like they're really not even as big as one big crew in Chicago. But we've got it all. We've got an underboss and who kind of doubled as a consigliere, and our boss has a brother. It's a Civella family, Nick Civella. And Nick and his brother Cork kind of jointly, but Nick really ran the family. And then they had this underboss guy named Carl Tuffy DeLuna.
The legends of America's mobs are woven into the fabric of society and pop culture. We've all seen the movies or heard the tales of these criminal organizations. Their stories of power, wealth, respect, family, greed, betrayal, violence, murder, and mayhem. While the golden age of the mobs may be over, organized crime continues to thrive, and the stories remain as infamous as ever. You're listening to the Gangland History Podcast, hosted by mob historian Jacob Stoops. He tells the true crime biographies of real-life mobsters and dives deep into the plots, subplots, and real facts behind organized crime in America. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Gangland History Podcast, formerly the members-only podcast. Got another great episode today. Very, very excited. I've been waiting to talk to this guest for quite some time. They're one of the originals in the mob podcasting genre, and because I've heard the feedback and I'm trying to listen to get out of the way, shut the heck up, and let my guest talk, I'm just gonna introduce it, and we're gonna jump right in. The guest today is Gary Jenkins, retired Kansas City police detective and author, documentarian. Runs his own podcast, of which now my name is very similar, the Gangland Wire. And I'll just say, welcome, Gary. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thanks, Jacob. Thanks for inviting me. I'm always happy to tell my story.
And I'm excited to hear your story, and we're kind of going to get into it front to back, cover to cover. I'm excited to talk a little bit about Kansas City. It's not a subject we've talked about a lot yet on my podcast. It has a really, really, really interesting history all the way from the beginning, and then Gary comes in, right in the middle of a lot of chaos, some of which has been portrayed on the big screen. And if you've listened to Gary's podcast, Gangland Wire, for any amount of time, one of my favorite qualities about Gary is, and I believe he kind of downplays how interesting his life has been. You've lived a really, really, really interesting life that, for people like me that literally come from small town nowhere, who have an interest in the genre but have no real connections, I'm just fascinated by it. And if you listen to your show, you really downplay it. You don't make too much out of yourself. And I think some listeners like myself really appreciate your modesty.
Well, thank you. I try. I guess I was raised that way. I don't know.
Yeah. So let's just jump right in. Let's talk a little bit about that. So tell us about your early life. Where do you come from? How were you raised? What were your parents like? And tell us about a young Gary Jenkins.
Oh, well, I come from small town America myself. Talking about coming from small town, it was about 1,600 people, and my people were farmers, and I did not want to farm. I'll tell you what I wanted. We had horses, and I grew up in the 50s, and cowboy, the way cop shows are now, well, that's cowboy movies, and cowboy TV shows were that. They were the thing. Radio shows, I go back to the original Lone Ranger on the radio.
Yep.
And when I grew up, I knew I wanted to be a cowboy. I wanted to have a horse. I wanted to have a 30-30 Winchester lever action rifle. I wanted to have a Colt 45 pistol and go out and save the settlers or the townspeople or whoever and be the good guy, wear the white hat. And, I did that. I grew up. I didn't get the Colt, the horse or the Colt 45 or the Winchester, but I got a 71 Plymouth Fury, and I got a Winchester 12-gauge shotgun, and I got a model 59, Smith and Wesson 38, and they send me out to save the settlers or help the townspeople. So my childhood dreams came true.
It reminds me.
Other than that, it was pretty uneventful childhood.
It reminds me a little bit, if you've if you've watched some of the Christmas movies that they show every year, it kind of reminds me of a young Ralphie from the Christmas Story. You had those kind of visions in your head of the Red Ryder BB gun.
I saved up and bought my own BB gun.
Yeah.
I had a BB gun and a BB pistol pretty early.
I see you didn't shoot your eye out, so good job with that.
I didn't shoot my eye out.
So sounds like you grew up in the Midwest. What and I can't remember if you've mentioned this before on your show. What city and state did you grow up in?
It was Plattsburgh, Missouri. It's about 50 miles north of Kansas City.
50 miles north of Kansas City.
As soon as I turned 18, 19 years old, I came to the city to get a job. I was not sticking around the small town. I wasn't a farm. My people were farmers. We had quite a little bit of farmland, actually, and my brother farmed it all his life.
And do you come from
two younger brothers? They didn't farm.
You come from a big family or a small family?
4 brothers. We had 4 brothers.
And
three. I had 3 brothers, so it was sports, fighting, going, hunting and fishing, and all the things that boys do. My mother must have been a saint to put up with us.
And do they did they become farmers? Did they get involved in the family business?
My oldest brother, he farmed all of his life.
Okay.
And he died 4 or 5 years ago. He was a little older than me, and my younger brothers didn't really. So right now I have some land. My other brother has some land. Another brother sold his, and so our cousins. We got a cousin that farmed all his life, so he's a big what they call a contract farmer. He plants all the beans and corns and everything, and I go up and look at it, but I don't really do anything with it. Neither my other brother has horses, and he lives up there, but that's
okay.
That's the extent of the farm.
So you grew up pretty normal childhood. At what point did you, when you graduated, did you go to school? Did you go directly into law enforcement? Tell us about your path after becoming an adult.
I had a checkered path. I took the long way around. I was always going to do everything my way. And I got married very young and had a child very young, and got a job. Never went to college. I was always the smart one. Matter of fact, one of the memories, one of the most vivid memories I have is my mom and dad standing there talking and looking down at me and saying, well, my mom says, well, Gary's going to go to medical school. My dad says, oh, no, he's going to go to law school. And so, everybody had big plans for me along those lines, but I had other plans. And so I got a job at a factory. First thing I did, get a job at a factory because I was always going to do everything on my own. Everything. It was always about doing everything on my own. And so I worked at the factory, and in 1970, I've been there about 5 years, and it's horrid work. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's good work and as far as benefits and money for a young, uneducated guy, but it's hard work. You just felt like when you came home from a day on the assembly line, somebody had been whacking you on the head with a 2x4 all day. And I saw this ad for the Kansas City Police Department, and they wanted to hire 350 guys. They got a big tax passed in the city, and we're going to increase the strength of the force by 350 people. They had all kinds of money for new programs and things they were going to do. They did one of the first cop show ever. They had a newsman ride along in a district car, a patrol car one night, and made it into like a 30-minute show on the news one night. And I saw that, and I thought, this looks right down my alley. This looks like fun. And there was a few cop shows on by then, and kind of knew, I always wanted to be this cowboy, and I always wanted to carry a gun and help save people or protect them from the bullies. And so I applied, and kind of a funny thing is I walked up the steps to headquarters, and a good friend of mine, Bobby Arnold, was walking down the steps. He was a year older than me, but we had been from adjoining farms. We'd rode horses together as kids. He wanted to be a cowboy too. and he wasn't going to farm. And he's walking down the steps, and I said, Bob, what are you doing here? And he said, I just got a job. I said, well, I'm going in to apply for one. So, we spent our career a lot of time together, actually, in the intelligence unit. He was my partner in the intelligence unit for several years. But, got on, and it takes about a year or so, time I do all the background and all that. But no problems there. I didn't have, I had a checkered history, but none of it really, I got away with it, my little discrepancies all my life. I was kind of a rounder when I was young. But be that as it may, I got on, went to the academy, the usual thing, go to the academy, spend however long it was, 3 months, I think, at the academy, and then you go out and you get a break-in officer. I'll never forget my break-in officer. He told me, he said, it was pretty unstructured in 1971. It was a lot different than it is today. So, folks, this is not the way it is today. But in 1971, it was different. And this guy, he's kind of a veteran. He probably had 8 or 9 years on, but he was kind of a veteran. And he told me, he said, the only reason that I've got you to break in is because the captain wants to keep me under control and not, keep me from doing some of the things I want to do. I said, oh, well, that's interesting. I said, well, okay. And I didn't think, I never liked the guy, but, I made it. I'm a pretty bright guy. I can work around a lot of things. And he was the kind of guy that, first little bit of corruption I ever saw that I ever took part in. We all have our little corruptions. Everybody out there's got little corruptions. And the first little corruption I saw, we stopped by the liquor store at 9th and State Line. And he said, I'm going to go in here and see this guy. He said, you smoke? I didn't smoke. He said, you smoke, and you smoke Winston's. I said, okay. And he smoked Winston's. So we go in and we talk to the guy, and they chat back and forth. I kind of knew him. And we're getting ready to leave, and the guy said, he said, you want a pack of cigarettes? And he said, well, yeah, I'll take a pack. And the guy looked at me and said, how about you? I said, well, yeah. He said, well, what do you smoke? I said, Winston's. So my break-in officer got 2 packs of Winston's that day instead of one. But, I only had to be with him about 6 weeks, I think, or a month. It wasn't a long time, and went out on my own, had my own district car for. Right off the bat, I got my own actual district. It was west side of downtown, down into the West Bottoms. I had the stockyards at the time and a lot of warehouses down there. And then downtown was, in 71, it was really hopping. There was a ton of people downtown, banks downtown. They'd have a bank robbery once in a while and a lot of events downtown. I was working days. So it was pretty exciting. I learned a lot. But a few months later, it wasn't like working what we call the East Side. It wasn't like working... trying to be politically correct here. It wasn't like working the ghetto. It wasn't like working the more poor neighborhoods. And that's where the action was. That's where the shooting was going on. And that's where the robbing and stealing, a lot of robbing and stealing. We'd have a bank robbery once in a while, but you'd swing by about 15 minutes after the bank robbers had left, usually. Although there was one guy that got shot, interrupted the bank robbery downtown during that time. I was off that day or something. But Sergeant says, anybody want to go to 150 sector? I said, put me in, coach, put me in. Go out there to 150 sector, and it's a pretty small district, 35th to 39th Paseo de Prospect, but it was hopping. I mean, it was lively. Had liquor stores on every corner and just, just a ton of criminals living within that boundaries and within the drug houses, and it had it all. And I got a district car out there, 154, and I worked that for the next couple of years. Had a lot of fun. I really started. What I always liked was a lot of guys like to make arrests. A lot of guys, like TAC guys, they like to kick in doors. Mm-hmm. I like to develop information and find out who's really doing stuff, and then try to set them up or make them on a case, rather than just stopping car after car after car and that kind of thing. And so, out there I had real deal criminals living out there, and you'd see with the warrant sheet come out, and there'd be people that, had warrants on them. And then you'd hear about somebody'd have, I remember this one little crew of bad check writers. And one of them lived in my district, and one of their partners lived real close. And I don't remember how I found out about it. Maybe one of them had a warrant on him at one time. And I started checking into them. I thought, well, these are real criminals. And they were professional fraudsters or professional bad check writers. They'd go break into a business, steal what they called a check protector machine. They'd steal a whole bunch of blank checks. And then they'd have other people that would go around and cash those checks. And so I figured out where one lived, and I'd sit on him for a little bit, find out what kind of car he drove, who came over to see him, and then figure out where his other buddy lived and see him around the neighborhood. And maybe I stopped one of them one time, and he was he started resisting him. I don't know. He didn't. Check writers they're not like armed robbers. He resisted a little bit, but he cut it short. And he was carrying some stolen credit cards. And so, I started working on that. I found where they had a secret apartment where they kept their stolen check protector and their extra checks. I turned a guy who I knew was running with them, and kind of charmed him into saying, he gave me an approximate area, 27th and Troost. So I just went over 27th and Troost and just started knocking on doors and finding this old guy. Said he was a landlord of an apartment building. He said, oh, yeah. He said, they don't really live up there. They just come and go once in a while. So I thought, I've got them now. This is their stash house. So I go down to the fraud unit and they get a search warrant and go and break in or, kick in the doors. But nobody's going to dare to even let you in. And actually, on that case, they didn't have to kick it in. The landlord was there. He let them in and found the check protector and the checks and all that, and made some cases on them. So that was, that really gave me a taste for that. Being a detective really gave me a taste for investigations, and just kept working on things like that. Came up with some other schemes that people were doing. Found a drug house. My buddy that lived that had 153 just north of me. We were district officers, so we had to answer calls. and so we'd take turns. We wanted to watch this drug house. And we didn't really know nobody too much knew what a drug house was in 1971, or 72, 73 by then. Nobody really knew what a drug house was unless you were out there. And our narcotics unit, they didn't work black narcotics. I didn't work African-American neighborhood for narcotics back then. They worked the white boys over in the east, at west side, the hippies. They were after hippies for narcotics back then. And I found this drug house and had some informant told me, and because I'd always working on developing informants. And so we'd go across the street to an abandoned house. One of us would get on the second floor and watch and write down the license numbers and see what was going on, while the other one would handle both. If the call came out for 154, 153 would jump in there and handle it if he could. And if he couldn't, then I'd hear it on my walkie-talkie, and I'd just run down out the back door and go handle the call. And then I'd do the same thing for him, and he'd do the same thing. And finally, one night, we were so stupid, we didn't know what we were doing, but we missed a drug delivery. We just, nobody was telling us what to do. We were just making it up on the fly. No rule book and no experience. And I saw this lady walk by, and she had a big grocery sack. And she kind of walked, as she drew my attention, I didn't know what the deal was, but there was something you just draws your attention, something she doesn't fit in the neighborhood. She walked about 3 or 4 steps by the sidewalk that went up the front door, and all of a sudden she just stopped, turned around, made almost like a kind of a hurried rush up to the front door, and then as she hit the top of the porch, the door opened, and she just went right in and closed right behind her. I thought, I called Walt. I said, come on. I said, there's something. They just did something. They just got a delivery, I think. In my mind, that was a delivery, and I'm sure it was. He comes flying down there, and we go over there, and, we didn't have a search warrant. We didn't even know anything about a search warrant. I'd heard of it, of course. We bang on the door, and somebody comes to the door, and we just push our way on in, but they're really resisting like heck. And now you're on really shaky grounds as far as, just like searching all through the house and everything. And we finally, they resisted so much, and it was going to get out of control and we were on such shaky grounds. I mean, nobody even knew we were down there. We had, our sergeant, we had the same sergeant. He didn't know what we were doing. Our captain didn't know what we were doing. None of the other guys around knew what we were doing. And so we just finally let it go. So that was, but you live and learn. And, I got transferred from that. I made my bones. Everybody knew, hey, this Gary, he's a hot shot. And they started a station detective unit. And, who are they going to select out of the 50 sector? And they wanted somebody from each sector. So, of course, I went to that. We wore suits and made cases and took them to court, took them down to filed felony charges on for burglaries, house burglaries, and larcenies, and other kind of smaller crimes out there in the neighborhood. So did that for the next couple of years.
And that's definitely a lot to unpack. So cut your teeth. This is 1970s time frame throughout probably the beginning and middle of the 1970s. Worked your way up, got training, learned how to become legit police officer. Sounds like you got into a few kind of potentially really dangerous situations, working drugs, nabbing criminals, just like the kind of the good guy you always wanted to be. And then you get noticed by the right people. You've got potential, and they say, all right, Gary, you're a detective. At what point do you go from being a detective and working normal cases to working the Kansas City Mafia?
Well, that's, again, I have pretty good run in that unit. We did some fun things and kind of worked some of the bigger cases that those guys might have worked and got noticed. And during this time, my friend Bobby Arnold from my hometown, he'd been in an attack unit, and they had a big shootout, and then they ended up busting up the attack unit, and he, through a series of connections, and this is kind of important. I know it doesn't seem important to a lot of people, but to go to the intelligence unit and work the mob, the intelligence unit is a small unit, 12 guys, 2 sergeants, 1 captain, and you work directly for the chief's office. There was no real chain of command between us and the chief, other than 2 sergeants and the captain. Captain would meet the chief, talk to the chief all the time. There was a major and a colonel, but they were just kind of there. They had other responsibilities, and they didn't really get too involved in what we were doing. And so it was a secret unit. It was kind of a unit that, there was working a mob. There's always potential for corruption, and you also had to be trusted because they gave you a lot of freedom. I used to say you could do whatever you're big enough to do, and the only thing you're constrained by is the law. Don't break the law in doing what you're trying to do. Other than that, you got a free reign. When I became a sergeant later on, that's what I'd tell my guys. And that's the way it was. So you needed somebody you could trust. Well, Bobby's wife had worked with this Ray Kenny's wife. Ray Kenny had been one of the founding members of the intelligence unit when they first founded back in, I'm going to say 1960 maybe. And so they needed a guy, and they wanted younger guys. The sergeant had some older guys that weren't doing anything, and they didn't want to do anything, and they were looking for younger guys who were more aggressive. And so Ray told Sergeant Wisher, he said, here's a guy. I know a lot about him. I know his wife, and my wife has known his wife for a long time. And he comes from a small town, and he's honest, and he doesn't seem to have too many bad habits any more than the normal. And I suggest you take him. And he's been a really aggressive young policeman, made his bones in his own way. And so they took Bobby down there. And then when they had this opening, Bobby tells his sergeant, said, here's a guy that I know, and I've known him since we were little kids. And if you ask around about him, you'll find he's an aggressive, good policeman. And, so they asked me to come down there and take this next opening. So, and then Bobby and I work in the same sector and partner up. So that's how I got down there. Then we just we are the young aggressive guys. I remember I had this one older guy. Let's go out for a beer after work, Gary. I said, okay. I kind of liked to drink back in those days, and we went to this bar, and he's talking, and he finally said, Gary, said, you don't have to work as hard as you're working. You really don't have to work near that hard. I looked at him, I said, Lee, I said, I'm gonna work just as hard as I want to work. Oh, okay. He never asked me out for a beer again. See, but they tried to make fun of us. That didn't work because our work was good. Sergeants loved us. The captain loved us. And so they tried to make fun of us, but I just turned around and made fun back of them. I never forget. I said, well, you guys, some guy was doing something that was stupid what he was doing. He didn't know what he was doing. I said, oh, you flogging that dead horse again? There was a poster board up there, and I drew a dead horse was a guy on its back with his legs up, and the guy standing there with a whip. And I said, oh, you're flogging a dead horse again, huh, Lynn? Oh, my God. So, see, I just threw it back at him, and Bobby wasn't bad as me. I'm a little bit bad about that, but he's a much nicer guy than I am.
Yeah,
but
they were the old guard, and you newcomers
right.
At that point in time trying to do the right thing and be aggressive and making them, probably those old timers who had gotten comfy in their job and in their role, and potentially with a certain amount of corruption, didn't want anybody to come in and rock the boat. And well, you young guys were probably making them look a little bad and look like maybe they weren't doing their job so well.
Yeah. And their defense, their only corruption was they were just lazy.
Lazy.
They didn't want to do anything. They were just lazy.
No defense against that. So who were some of the characters at the time in the mob that you guys were really focused on?
When I went down there, of course, we've got a family, a crime family. Yep. For you listeners that don't, and viewers don't really know, Kansas City has a real deal, old school mob family, the Cosa Nostra family, yep. Sicilian based, have the making ceremony, the whole 9 yards, have made men, have associates. They're not very big, so it's like they're really not even as big as one big crew in Chicago. But we've got it all. We've got an underboss and who kind of doubled as a consigliere, and our boss has a brother. It's a Civella family, Nick Civella. And Nick and his brother Cork kind of jointly, but Nick really ran the family. And then they had this underboss guy named Carl Tuffy DeLuna. And then there was, associates, and they were connected to different businesses around. Like one guy was a real money maker for him. He was a made guy and had got caught in the middle of a hit one time, or they didn't get the guy killed, and had to he actually beat the case. But he was a made guy, and he ran a record store, Tiger Cardarella, and every booster in Kansas City fanned out throughout the whole Midwest stealing record albums, back when record albums were really easy to steal and bring them in, fill that record shop up. And everybody in Kansas City of a certain age, you ask them in a joint setting, I'll like do programs. And if I say something about Tiger, I say, how many people here ever bought a record from Tiger Cardarella or Tiger's Records? Almost every hand will go up. Well, I bought one, about 3/4 of the price. He was buying for about 50 or 25 cents on the dollar, 25 to 50 cents on the dollar, and selling them for like 75 cents on the dollar out to the public. So, you had all that, and it was mainly down around what we call the North End. It was close to downtown, the city market. Little Italy's all down in this kind of geographically small area adjacent to downtown, and all around the city market, which most Italian sections, they all came from Sicily. They all settled in a Little Italy area around a big Catholic church and close to the city market. And they had the spaghetti joints, as they used to call them. They had produce businesses and other things like that. Because government jobs, when they first got here, government jobs, Irish already had them. The Germans had the better government jobs because they've been here a little longer. And so they had to make do. They were kept pushed out of everything. Every new immigrant society is like that even today. Your new immigrant, he has to start at the bottom. And so you got all these young, bright guys, and come to Kansas City and Prohibition comes along. I mean, it's the same story in every city.
It is. It is.
And they kind of push out the old guys, and Nick Savella kind of comes up through that. He's a real young guy during that time, and so we've got this mob family. And then I come in. Well, Sergeant Wisher, Larry Wisher, he gives us an assignment. He has heard it. I don't know where he heard it, probably from the Bureau, because we worked real hand in glove with the FBI. Whenever the one squad, or the organized crime squad would get a new detective, new agent, they'd send him over to the intelligence unit to get to know us. And the real old timers over there, they were always back and forth and really close with our sergeants and the captain. And because we fed all of our information to them, because we were out looking and writing down license numbers and seeing who was where and what businesses they were going to and who their girlfriends might have been, and trying to develop informants and just everything they were doing. The Bureau didn't do that quite so much. And there's this one guy that I imagine somebody at the Bureau maybe told Larry, I don't know, but he called Bobby and I in. He said, there's a guy who just got out of the penitentiary named Jimmy Duardi, Duardi. And he is a made guy, and he supposedly is hanging out at this used car lot at Gregory and Truce, which was it was a south side compared to the city market. It was about 70 blocks south of downtown. And so we go out there, and first thing you do drive-bys,
mm-hmm.
and write down some license numbers. Maybe it's a car lot, so maybe you go in, act like you want to buy a car, and just kind of look around, maybe find out who a salesman is there, and get a card, pick up a few tags, go back the next day, pick up a few tags. Maybe this was a hard place to sit on. We sat down the street for a little bit, but you didn't want to sit too long, because you didn't see a spot. If it turns out to be a hot spot, you don't want to burn it, because then they'll quit going. So you have to be slick. And so we picked up enough tags that we picked up Jimmy Duardi's tag. We picked up a couple other kind of mob associates tags. So we know, okay, this is a mob location. We do a background check on the business, who has the licenses. We find another guy who's an associate. About that time, the Bureau gets back and said, oh yeah, I said, we got a case working on some fraudulent business loans, or some fraudulent loans connected to that guy, Joe Civigliano, that owns that car lot. Interesting. So we just keep poking around for a couple of 3 weeks, and then and Jimmy Duardi's there a lot, and we want to get some pictures. And, these other guys, they never used the cameras. They never did anything. I sound kind of arrogant here when it comes to this, and I don't want to keep putting them down. That'll be the last thing I say about it. But we had these cameras with 500,000 millimeter lenses, but they never use them. So we went to there's one reason it was so hard to sit on. Right across the street for a block, both ways, was a funeral home. I mean, not a funeral home, but a cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't really sit out in the cemetery, because you stick out like a sore thumb if you just sit there. So we went to the guy that managed the cemetery. It's Bobby's idea. And we asked him if he'd set up a cemetery tent, like there was going to be a service, and it was cold enough that you could kind of get away with this. And we said, just close it in on all four sides. So then we'd drive up early in the morning before anybody'd really get around, and we'd get in the tent, and with our camera and our tripod, and we'd just take pictures directly, we're looking right down their throat from just across the street, and they didn't even notice. We did that for about a week and got a ton of pictures, and got some great pictures of Jimmy Duardi, and I never saved one of them. I should have taken some of those home with me. And documented all the other things. There was a guy in there that all of a sudden we weren't seeing anymore, and he had a tow truck, and I had his license. So I had a name of a tow company, and I checked the business license on the tow company, found out he had a body shop about 10, 15 blocks away over on Prospect. And like I said, all of a sudden he's there every day, and then all of a sudden he's not ever there. Something happened here. So we just go over there and just walk in, and this was unheard of for the intelligence unit at the time. They always just sat back and watched and wrote license numbers down. We just walked in, and I put a badge on. I was so used to doing that anyhow. I said, hey, I'm Kansas City Police. what were you doing over at that car lot? This guy, he was like, yeah, I used to go. Those are some bad people. I don't want anything to do with them. Okay, so how you doing? How's your business here? What do you do here? Oh, who do we know in common? We haven't, those usual kind of things. We haven't know anybody in common, and do you have any problems here? Anything I can help you with? You got any tickets I can take care of? And talk to his wife, works there with him, kind of butter her up a little bit, and leave and come back and just talk to him about maybe detailing the car out. And then he had a car for sale. He was kind of a half-ass used car salesman himself. He'd find a deal on a car and fix it up a little bit. He'd do body work and had a body man working for him. Fix it up, slick it up, and Bobby started talking to him about buying a car from him. He ended up buying it from him, actually. And I ended up having him detail my car in the end. But over that, all of a sudden, he really started liking us. And he had something on his mind. And finally one day, he said, I might as well go ahead and tell you. So, well, John, what's that? He said, Carl Spero was hanging out over there a lot. And he started telling us about some other guys, a guy named Leonard Crago. He said, they call him the Arab. He says, the scariest man I ever saw. And he said, what I used to do when they'd have meetings there, and there was another guy who was some kind of professional criminal. I called him Strong, I think, Red Strong or something like that. And he said he's some kind of professional criminal from out of town. He said this Arab guy, he's some kind of a killer guy. And he and Carl Spero used to go back in a little meeting room back there and have meetings. And actually the office for the car salesman, car dealership or used car dealership, it was just a kind of a big shack is what it was. He said, but we had a garage there and we had a parts department in the garage. It was adjoining that. And he said, I'd go back in the parts department and listen through the wall, see what they're saying. He said, man, they work like heck to get this Leonard Crago out of jail and to come up here and do something. He said, I don't know what he's going to do. So, hey, this is good. And then he tells us that he has his tow truck and his big secret. He said, you probably already know this. I better go ahead and tell you. He said, I got a call from Carl once, and he wanted me to meet him down here in South Central Missouri, and he needed me to pull some truck out of a ditch. And he said, I don't know exactly what he meant, but I knew there was something wrong about it. And he said, I got down there, and they had a trailer, a tractor, and a lowboy trailer with a bulldozer on it. And he said, I pulled him out of the ditch, and he said, that bulldozer was stolen. So I started searching reports in the metro area, and I found this was about a month or so before this happened, and so I knew about what date it was within a few days, and I found a stolen bulldozer just like he described, and we ended up tracing down that bulldozer a few months later. So he had sold it to some guy down there in the country.
So did you ever have any surveillance work or personal interactions with the Civellas themselves, the top guys, or did they stay pretty kind of far away on the periphery, not interacting with the day-to-day? Because by this point in time, Nick Civella was long time in power at the end, I would say, of his reign. And we'll get into some of the problems that came along with that. Did you ever have any personal interactions with those guys?
With Nick Civella was an interesting guy. He was quiet. He had a driver, a guy named Pete Tamburello. He might come to the city market. You'd see him talking to somebody down there, but I personally never walked up and said, "Hey Nick, how you doing? Tell me something." A couple of FBI agents would do that once in a while, but I never did that. But you see him and Pete down there, and then they drive off. You might follow them a little bit and see where they went. They never really went too many places. Nick stayed back. He was like the Godfather. He was the puppet master of the Godfather. He pulled the strings from back behind. He had this Tuffy de Luna who was out there, and he would go to talk to people, and see what they were doing. Tuffy was a tough one to follow and find out what he was doing. There was always, follow him to some business, then you would have to go research everything about that business and see who always maybe do a short, quick surveillance on it and see what kind of a spot it was. and so you would, just track them around and see what kind of what their pattern was. They would go to this Villa Capri a lot. It was the pizza place. It will become famous later on. The reason why I mentioned this, it would go to the Villa Capri a lot, both day, afternoon, maybe, and nights. They had the social club. They called it the Trap. It was the Northview Social Club, but they called it the Trap. For some reason, I never knew what the etymology of why they called it the Trap. And so they would go down there and they play cards down there, and we write license numbers down, maybe pick up on somebody else who was down there we hadn't seen for a while, follow them away and see where they were going. And that was, those were our days, and hit some other spots that, they would be at. And so, really, we'd never really talked to any of those guys. We may try to find, they went to some business, and there might be somebody there that could enlighten you more about what they were doing, like I did with this John guy, this tow truck driver. Might go in and try to talk to them, but there was no use us even trying to talk to these guys. They weren't going to talk to us. And so that's, that was kind of the extent of, if they saw me meet with Willie Comisano for a while, that would be an unusual meeting. Because what happens is you document these different meetings, you document where they're going, and then something else a month from now, or maybe if they've already got it documented, or some other informants telling the Bureau something, because Bureau had some informants that were pretty highly placed. And so all of a sudden what that informant's saying, or what they hear on another wiretap somewhere, will then make sense because they've got these reports. And so at the time, there was a lot of activity, shall we say, going on. There was more than anybody could keep up with by 1975. And some of it had to do with the Civellas, some of it had to do with the Comisanos, some of it, and then there was this whole other mob war between the Spero brothers and the Civella brothers. Yep. So it just got crazy. Just we were constantly running around trying to figure out what was going on, who was meeting who, and there were bodies being found, and it was just nuts.
In Kansas City, by this point in time, and probably for some time by the mid 70s, had been big into Vegas in combination with Chicago, Milwaukee, and most other families across the country had a piece of Vegas. But the edge of the Midwest was Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and possibly St. Louis as being, the closest from the Midwest to Vegas, and really kind of really running things. And Kansas City was a big part of that. And you've done a lot of work yourself with respect to documenting. I mean, you were involved in a lot of the investigations with respect to the Vegas Skim. So tell us a little bit about that connection and kind of where you fit into the picture with respect to investigating Kansas City and Vegas.
Well, I was kind of like the low rung on the ladder here, but the lowest figure on the totem pole in that investigation. But I was in there and I was part of it. It was. I mentioned the Villa Capri where they would go to. We had like probably a year or two worth of surveillance reports of them meeting at the Villa Capri. So we had this mob war going on, and they're stalking each other. These other brothers, the Spero brothers, the Civellas, Speros, and they're stalking each other. And we catch them doing that every once in a while too. Like you catch Carl or Mike or somebody at a place, and then you'll see one of these other guys driving, just like a policeman, like us. They were just like us. They would drive around and see, where they were. And they were out trying to find people who were informants for them to help set down these upstart Young Turk Spero brothers. And the Spero brothers, they didn't even know about the Skim. We didn't know about the Skim. The Bureau knew, it was probably going on, but they didn't know exactly how. They knew more really about, and not our office, St. Louis office and Las Vegas office and Detroit knew about something that Detroit and St. Louis had going on out there at the Atlanta, I think, or Atlanta, but Kansas City, they didn't know exactly what it was. knew we had a really close relationship with the Teamsters, but you didn't know, you can guess, but you don't really have the inside information. And so that's where the wiretaps and the bugs come in. And so we hear, the Bureau hears that, especially that they always talk about some of their plans at this Villa Capri, which is this restaurant at Independence and Prospect. Rossi Strada, a longtime mob associate and sportsbook, owns it, and they always sit at the same table. You know how people, like, they go in a restaurant all the time, they'll many times sit at exactly the same table, and these guys are like, God over there in that
creatures
area
of habit.
went into Villa Capri, so nobody else sat at their little banquette and tables. And the Bureau had picked up from an informant that, he had some what we call dirty talk at this one table about planting a bomb on a strip club owner that they wanted to extort some money from. So to get probable cause to put a microphone in there where they're making these plans about different things, and hopefully hear them talking about, making some plan or getting some clue on a murder plot, they get a affidavit and a order to put a bug in the Villa Capri, which is the famous bug that's in the movie Casino. It may make it look like it's in a corner store and it's up in a vent. Well, this was down on the floor, I think, somewhere in that table. And so they get that bug in there and they start hearing stuff. And as agent, my friend Bill Owsley said, I never heard the song Staying Alive so much in my life. Listening to that bug and the tape from that bug. But finally one night it gets kind of quiet and you can hear Tuffy DeLuna and Cork-Civella talking, and they're talking about Las Vegas, and they're talking about $25 million, and they're talking about Lefty, and they're talking about the Genius, and they're talking about Jay Brown. Oh yeah, he cashed that check at the Stardust, remember? Oh, and then somebody said, well, we in on that with them. I think that was shortly after the $25 million and the Teamsters and something about paying the Teamsters. And so that was enough to say, oh, well, there's something going on here. We don't know what it is. Start figuring out who Alan Glick, or the Genius was Alan Glick, and they get a little background on him real quick and find he's got a Teamsters loan and he's bought 4 casinos, and Jay Brown was Oscar Goodman's law partner, and he was a corporate counsel for Alan Glick at the Stardust, and the Argent Corporation owned these 4 casinos. So it's building, and like one of the next times, Tuffy's in there and they're talking about getting hold of somebody in Las Vegas, and Tuffy says, "Well, I got to find a phone." But there was a phone right there, and he didn't use it. So when he says, "I got to find a phone," you got to find that phone. We got to find that phone. And, right. And Bureau, I tell you what, they had I think 3 pilots, 2 of them they brought in. They had one here. They had one plane here. They brought in another plane from another office. They always had one on the ground and one in the air. When one ran out of gas, the other one could then get up. They brought in about 20 agents. They got a whole bunch of us from the intelligence unit and gave us FBI walkie-talkies. And we laid on Tuffy DeLuna and a couple of other guys that were close to him, Cork-Civella, I think, and maybe Joe Ragusa. We had codes, had all these codes that, like, I remember Cork was cognac. It was always some kind of, Ragusa was rum, Tuffy was tequila, and so it was some kind of a booze that had the same first initials, the name you called these people. And so we just started following them. Finally, they set Tuffy down at this hotel. It was in an industrial area. It was kind of a nicer hotel, but it was an industrial area, but right next to I-435, right next to the Beltway freeway that goes around the city. And so catch him down there, and he goes in, and somebody, probably not the first time, but when he stayed in there a long time, somebody probably got out and went up and just walked in the lobby, and they seen back on the payphone. So then, okay, here's the payphone. So now you got a pattern. Anytime he would leave his house, you just sit close and watch him leave his house, get somebody down there on that hotel. And you don't really have to follow him all the way down. Follow him around a little bit, but don't get burnt. Let him go if you think, there's any problem at all, because he was real tail conscious, tail conscious. He was looking for the airplane. He'd stop and just stare up in the air. If he'd see if he'd see that airplane making a lazy circle around him, why he'd just, he'd go on. He'd drive down in the airport. We have an older airport close to downtown. He'd drive down the airport and then drive out real fast because he knew a plane couldn't come into there.
Mm-hmm.
But I got him set down, and you didn't have to then follow him down there. And they got enough probable cause to put a wire on those phones, and then all they had to do is catch him, just leave somebody down there, and when they see him pull up and go in, from a van or a business, I don't remember exactly where they sat down there, then just call down at the wire room, say, okay, he's in, and then they just start listening to all 4 phones, and whichever one he gets on, then they start listening to that phone, and they can turn on the recording device as soon as they hear a little bit of dirty talk. So he's talking to this Joe Augusto who works at the Tropicana. So we're all focused on the Stardust and Lefty Rosenthal and Alan Gleck, but he's talking to this guy at the Tropicana. So in the end, it really got confusing for everybody. In the end, there's 2 streams of Skim. One coming from the Tropicana directly to Nick Savella. He developed that Skim himself without any help from Chicago, no Teamsters money, no help from Milwaukee. It was just him and this guy, Joe Augusto, who was now the show manager of the Folies Bergère show. And all he was from Sicily. He had a great Sicilian accent, and he'd just been a con man all his life, but he was good. And he worked his way in with the people at the Trop, and they wanted, and how he did this, he convinced them that he had connections to the Teamsters, and of course through the mob. Those guys that ran it, there were several principals that ran it, but they knew he had connections to the mob in Kansas City, and they could get the Teamsters loan that they wanted. And they wanted to expand, and they needed a Teamsters loan to do it. And so they thought Joe Augusto would do it. So they let him have this position of authority and power at the casino. And so Nick Savella, first thing he does is tell his Teamsters people, don't give them a loan until I tell you to. And so he just withheld the loan. And Joe, he just string them along. Like I said, he was a great con man, so he could string them along. Yep. And so we're hearing all these conversations. Well, Joe is repeating gossip because he hates Lefty Rosenthal, and Lefty is really showing his butt at this point in time. This is during the time when the Nevada Gaming Commission is trying to kick him out. He's having hearings, and he's already been to court, been kicked out of the casino, and then had an appeal, won on appeal, and came back into the casino. And Nick, he knows that he does not want this guy to keep all this stirred up, everything stirred up and in the newspapers. And Lefty was a guy who wanted to be in the newspapers. He wanted to be bigger than life. And he wants to stay in that casino because he knows that's his golden ticket. He's already making $250,000 a year in like 1970s to be the casino manager. Plus he liked that control of 4 casinos. I mean, he was, this was like, I got my dream. I got my horse and my gun. He got his dream. He owns 4, or he's running 4 casinos, and he puts the sports book into one. He starts a sports book and hires women dealers and the blackjack tables. He was kind of an innovator. Yep. He really was. He was also a top echelon informant during all this time too.
Most of the time.
I think he probably jerked the FBI off as much as he gave him good information because he was that guy. He was that guy. You could not trust that guy. But so Joe is reporting all this gossip about Lefty, and it really gets interesting because we get then we got another hidden microphone with Nick Savella meeting Tuffy de Luna at a lawyer's office, his lawyer's office downtown. And they got the probable cause to put a bug in that lawyer's office. When the lawyer wasn't there, you could listen because they weren't talking law business. They weren't talking court cases. They were talking Lefty Rosenthal a lot. And they were also talking about setting up a meeting with Joey Aiuppa in Chicago and a lot of really cool things. And so, we'd hear them talking about, we need to go talk to Lefty. One of the really cool things I heard on those tapes was Tuffy de Luna and Nick Savella are talking about whether Nick can call Lefty directly. or does he have to go through Chicago? And they'd already talked about how Chicago didn't want to believe anything bad about Lefty. And Joe Augusto is telling him he's a snitch. And Tuffy's telling, Nick that, hey, Joe says he's a snitch, but I don't really believe that. And Nick, he's saying, well, in some ways he is, because he tried to in a way blackmail Harry Reid, who was the president of the Gaming Control Board. He tried to kind of like blackmail him by saying, well, we had lunch one time, you're with me, what's going on here? And in Nick's mind, that's being a snitch. He said, you're going to make those people mad. So we got to cool this Lefty down. So they were counseling back and forth, and Lefty was, and Tuffy was always counseling Nick. And he said, and finally he said, he said, we had a meeting in Chicago about this. I think you can talk to him directly. So then they start figuring out how to get the message to Lefty without anybody else knowing. And then Lefty, eventually he did call Nick, and they got that phone call. And Nick is nice, but he keeps telling him, he said, you're going to hurt a lot of people if you keep this up. There's a lot of money at stake here, and you're going to hurt people. And after that phone call, Lefty acts like he always said, okay, I'll calm down. I'll cool it. But he can't cool it, because if he does, he's just going to get kicked out of the casino. And so they come back, and Nick is telling Tuffy about the call. And he said, I told him, just cool it. And Tuffy's going, yeah, but, I think he might lie to you, Nick. So it was really enlightening about how Nick Civella worked, how he was a diplomat. He was willing to talk and convince people to do the right thing before he ever resorted to
violence.
And Tuffy counseled with him on that. It was really enlightening to listen to those tapes.
And we ultimately know that Rosenthal does eventually get blown up. He lives and lives out the rest of his life, but he does eventually get blown up. Most people believe that was out of Chicago, possibly to do with Tony Spilatro, of course, to do with all of the things going on with the Skim. One thing I will say is a lot of people watch Casino and they see the scenes with the politician who then turns Robert De Niro's character away, who is Lefty Rosenthal, from the gaming board and kicks him out. People don't know that that's based on Harry Reid. Harry Reid, who became very famous, I believe, as either a senator or a representative. I can't remember. Yeah, senator.
He was a senator.
Yeah.
He was the.
And people don't know that he had a bit of a dastardly past. He was that guy. Now, one question we're kind of along the lines of the movie Casino a little bit. And I was curious if are you aware that your name is mentioned in the book Casino?
Yeah, there's a nice shopping area. I used to live close to it over in the city, and I'm walking down the street, and there's this young policeman I knew. He said, "Hey, Gary, what's going on? Hey, how you doing?" He said, "Did you know that I was reading this book about the Mafia, and your name's in there?" I said, "What?" Casino, yeah. I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah." And he told me the name of it. So there's a Barnes & Noble down the street. So I ran over to Barnes & Noble and I started thumbing through, and I found my name in there.
That's right.
It's in there, folks, just because I was there helping serve the search warrant on Tuffy Luna, the underboss's house. And that's the place where they found the very famous records that he kept.
Yeah. And that's the funny thing is, so if you equate to the movie, and I'm just going to read it for those people that have this book, it's page 303. And I'm going to say, so I had listened to
Gary's, to know that page number.
yeah. So I had listened to Gary's podcast for quite a while, of course, big movie buff. So I had watched the movie. And when I first started listening to Gary's podcast, I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. He was a detective. He worked against these guys, but it never really registered exactly to what level. And again, I think Gary underplays it a little bit until I started reading this book, and I get, I'm pretty deep into the book, and it's page 303. And I come across, and I'm just going to read it. I come across the excerpt that says, quote, less than 3 months after the Marlowe meeting, FBI agent Shay Airy and Gary Jenkins of the Kansas City Police Intelligence Unit knocked on Carl DeLuna's door and presented him with a search warrant, allowing them to look for records and papers. And this scene is in Casino. Well, that's you. This scene of serving the warrant, it's Artie Piscano in Casino. Well, that's Tuffy DeLuna, and that's Gary. Yeah. That was pretty cool. That like everything just kind of like snapped together in my brain, and I that's when I kind of pieced it all together, and I was like, "Holy crap!" Yeah. So
Tuffy was a pretty nice guy. He was a good mobster. He was a real mobster, just like Nick Civella, and he modeled himself after Nick Civella. And Nick's brother Cork was fiery. He was angry. He was blustery. He yell at you and kind of crazy kind of stuff. But Tuffy was just like that. Tuffy had been an armed robber when he was young. He used to fly around the country and rob supermarkets on paydays, on people's paydays. Supermarkets used to have $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 in them on the weekend to cash checks before ATMs, and that was kind of what he did at first. And he came up through that. His sister is married to Tony Ripe-Civella's, Nick's nephew, so he's blood in the blood, which that's what those guys like, is you're not gonna rat out somebody and testify against them when you got family. That's the thing about Kansas City, it's a small town. Nobody ever testified. Nobody ever became a witness. They might have given a little information now and then, but nobody ever became a witness, partly because you have all this extended family, and it's kind of a small community, and so they know each other. And for the next, the rest of their lives, they're gonna be going to weddings and funerals and see each other at the grocery store. These, your rat family and your non-rap family, and so it's and so he was married into the family. And Tuffy was quiet. He told his wife, he said, Sandy, make these officers some coffee. So she made us some coffee. As his kid came in, and he like got all out of hand, was yelling, and he told Sandy, Sandy said, call so and so and have him come over and get Rick. He's just quiet as heck. And I never forget at the last. Pledge, should have put this in. I'll tell you a little story about where that came from in a minute. But he told Shay Airy, he knew Shay. Shay had been a mob investigator for a long time. He and Bill Owsley were the main mob investigators for a long time in Kansas City. And he said, Shay said, you might as well come downstairs. That's where the good stuff is. and that's where they found the notes. So, here's how Nick, I never talked to Nick Pileggi. I tried to get him to be on my documentary, and then he bailed out at the last minute. I tried to get him to come on the podcast, and then he just simply refused to. But there was a newspaper article written on the 10th anniversary by a local reporter named Bill Norton, and he lifted all that directly from that newspaper article, directly. And I don't know if he attributed it to it or not. I've never gone back and looked. I don't think there's any footnotes in that book, but maybe there is. But he lifted all that. There's another guy, Harold Nichols, I think he quoted him. And, it was all directly from Bill Norton interviewing us and writing that newspaper article. So, but not to take anything away from Pledgy, other than he stood me up twice to be on my show. He did call me. I talked to him. I said, I'm the guy that you putting my name in there. And that's when he said he'd be in my documentary, but then he wouldn't. He bailed out. Cost me a round trip airfare that for myself and for a cameraman. I was going to fly back to New York. But he did do his work. He'd come to Kansas City, and this retired FBI agent, Bill Owsley, had taken a lot of stuff home, and he was the case agent on all this. And he spent like 3 days in Kansas City talking to Bill and going through papers and all that. So he did do his work, but he did lift that article directly from that stuff.
So eventually, Nick Civella dies in 1983. Eventually, these guys go down in one way or another. But before they go down, and maybe without getting too far into it, because I want to be respectful of time, they have the the Spero-Civella War, which you've covered in a documentary. I believe it's called Brothers Against Brothers, which is on Amazon. You can go buy it for, I believe, $9.99. It's pretty reasonable.
You can rent it for $2.99.
Well, there you go. You can rent it for $2.99. And it was, I think you did it about 4 or 5 years ago, so it's still there. Mm-hmm. I'll put the link in the video description. But for those who are unaware of Kansas City's history in this particularly violent time, can you give us a little bit about the Spero War?
So, like I said, all this time, they put the bug in, then they figure they get the wiretaps going, and really they kind of back off. All they got to do now is listen and trace it to other cities, and a lot of work farmed out to Chicago and Milwaukee and Cleveland because they know they're involved, and then in Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of, there's not so much need for a lot of manpower, but at the same time, this Spero War kicks off. And so we go into that, and our job was to do nothing but follow this one Spero brother around. See, they had what really kicked it off. This was before the arrest or anything came down. It was, when was it? It was before, I think it was after we served the search warrants, but anyhow, I think it was 1978. And the 3 Spero brothers, they'd already killed the oldest brother several years before. Somebody had, and he was a guy that Nick Civella would have to approve of his murder. The 3 younger brothers were in a tavern called the Virginia Tavern, and they had been plotting. They wanted to move in on Civella's a little bit, and they wanted a revenge, I believe, for the oldest brother that had been killed. So
can I stop you for a second? Yeah. Were the Spero brothers upstarts? Were they younger than the Civellas, or were they the same age?
No, they were younger. See, like Nick Civella is more like my mom's age, and Carl DeLuna and Cork were more like my mom's age at the time, and Cork Tuffy was more like, he was probably 15 years older than me, so they were the older. These guys were more like my age at the time. I think Carl might even been a couple years younger. So they were younger guys. They were coming up. They were never taken in close into the mob. They were not made guys. Outsiders. They were like the blue collar. They were like the blue collar crew. And they were pretty good thieves, especially the youngest brother, a really good thief, and the oldest brother was too, and they made a lot of money off of them, but they were never in close.
They were just associates, not made.
Right. Okay. And so they're, like I said, they want revenge for Nick, and they want to move in. Carl Spero was interviewing people, if you will. I talked to a Peckerwood, a non-Italian guy, that he interviewed about, come with me, because he was getting non-Italian guys. He got this Leonard Krigo out of jail just to be on his team, shall we say, and his crew. And he sent Leonard Krigo, that my informant told me about. He sent him in on a Civella bookmaker and a partner in a business that Nick Civella owned, another meat market, and he robbed him. And Krigo was so crazy that he put the guy in the trunk of his car. After he robbed him, he got about 10 grand off of him because he was a bookie and he had a lot of cash there. And he had 2 guns, and he fired into the trunk of this big old Lincoln a whole bunch of times. He never hit the guy. The guy got behind, his grandson told me, he said, Grandpa got behind a tire in there that was loose, and he never hit him. And the stupid guy yells out, "You tell Nick Civella that the Arab's back in town." And that's what everybody called him, was the Arab. And everybody knew the Arab was with Carl Spero by then. So, they figured out that Spero was making some kind of moves here.
Yeah.
And so then they start putting together guys, and they start stalking the Speros. The Speros are stalking them. And like Joe Spero hides outside of Tuffy's house and shoots at him with the deer rifle one night, misses him. They got a bomb. The Speros got a bomb they're going to plant on Tuffy de Luna. Well, Tuffy and a couple other guys, we're pretty sure it was Tuffy. He takes 3 guys one night to the Virginia Tavern, and all 3 Spero brothers that are still alive are in there. And they come in the back door, and they see Joe and Mike sitting at a table to their left, and 2 guys spin off towards that table and just start shooting at them. and they go down. Carl Spero's across the room by the front door on the phone, and the guy with the shotgun, who was probably Tuffy DeLuna, chases him out the front door, and they're like running down Admiral Boulevard, which is a 4-lane wide, pretty good-sized street. It was night, so there wasn't a lot of traffic. So he's out there with his 12-gauge shotgun, pump shotgun, chasing Carl down the street. And finally, he fires a round at him and he takes him down. But he doesn't go up and give him the coup de grace. And Carl is crippled and he's paralyzed from his waist down the rest of his life. But so it's really on now. I mean, the gloves are off and it's full on war now after this. That's when the Speros, they get this remote control bomb. Carl gets his dynamite from Arkansas, and he gets another professional criminal to make the remote control detonating device. They get it under Tuffy's car, but it won't go off. They're not close enough to it. But we had an informant in with Joe at that time, and we ended up recovering the bomb and taking off Joe and getting him a conviction. Well, right after his conviction, he's over at a storage facility, and he goes to go in it, and he has dynamite stored in there and guns, and the dynamite explodes, and it looked like maybe dynamite started on the outside, but there's sympathetic explosion on the inside, and it just blew out the whole end of the storage facility, plus his car was sitting there and blew it all to pieces, killed him. They'd killed Mike at the Virginian, so now there's only Carl left. So it's still war on Carl. They're still planted bombs on him once, and his nephew found it. But finally, in 1884, about the same year I got promoted to sergeant, they got a bomb underneath Carl Spero with a remote device and blew him up. He had a used car lot going. He wasn't really selling cars. He was selling drugs and guns and buying swag from boosters and reselling it to people. And he was a delighted dealer by that point in time. And it blew him clear out of the top of the shack, him in his wheelchair, and dumped him out in the parking lot. It was unbelievable. So that's the end of the Spero War, and the Civellas are in trial about this time with the guys from Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee, and they end up the leadership all goes to prison for quite a while. They're done, really. Nick Civella dies just before the trial.
Yep, and the KC mob limps on. I believe it's Willie the Rat Camusano steps up next, and I think eventually his son steps up, who's, I believe his son recently passed away in the last year or 2 years.
He did a couple years when COVID started. He got COVID early on. Then he had a stroke while he was in the hospital from really bad long-term COVID, and then he had a stroke and he died out of that. So they say Johnny George Shortino is the boss now. I don't know. Those guys still get together. There's still kind of a structure around. There's something going on. There's probably a sports book going on. We don't have legalized gambling yet here.
But it's certainly not like the heyday in probably the 60s and 70s under the Civellas, much like most other families across the country, with the exception of a few. Many have become defunct. Sounds like Kansas City is not quite there. I don't want to say it's on its last legs, but it's not where it was in the heyday. Eventually you get promoted, and you work out the rest of your career and you retire in the 90s. And then
I came back to the intelligence unit for a couple of years, but it was kind of anticlimactical by then.
You take down the big bosses, so to speak. It's probably kind of like, well, who else is there to take down? I'm sure there always was, the next guy up from a criminal standpoint, but the Mafia is a pretty big target. So eventually you retire and you go back to school, and you get your degree to practice as a lawyer. What made you do that?
Because I never lived up to my potential when I was young. I never did what I was capable of doing, and now I've got time to do it.
And what kind of law did you practice?
At my retirement ceremony, this guy was kind of running, it's a friend of mine, and Colonel Lynch, and he said, I got in Gary's file, and he said, it took him 30 years to get his undergrad degree. And it did. I started 30 years before that and finally got it just as I retired, and then went to law school. It took me 3 years to go to law school. And I worked for myself. I had an offer from a judge to be his clerk, but I told him, I said, I've had enough of working for the government. I just worked for myself. And I did. I tell you what I did. I did a lot of used car fraud cases, Missouri Merchandising Practices Act. So it was I had a bad guy now, and I had the good guys who had bought the cars and been cheated. And so I did that, but I did a ton of police divorces and traffic tickets for sons and grandsons of cops, and then their friends, and just kind of build a practice, and just a general practice. I just whatever came my way. And by the end, I did some wills and some estate plan stuff, simple stuff. If you had a lot of money, I'd send them to somebody else. But if it it was like most of us, you got an IRA, and you got a pension, you got a home, maybe you have a vacation home. Why, that's pretty straightforward kind of stuff.
Do you still practice?
No, I don't. I finally
retired. Second retirement.
Second retirement. Yeah, I practiced from 2000 till about 20. I practiced 20 years. So I was 25 years on the police department and 20 years as a lawyer.
I mean, most people would consider either one of those things to be incredibly accomplished. And well, you did both. So kudos to you. And well, for the last 10 years, it seems like I get the impression that you're somebody that likes to stay busy. And right. For the last 10 years or so, you've been, I would say, at the bleeding edge of what has become podcasting in the mob genre. You run Gangland Wire, and you've done, last count, I think something like 400 or 500 different episodes, which I could only aspire to at this point. That seems so far off on the horizon. What made you start a podcast?
Well, I don't know. I did the first movie, Gangland Wire, and I'd done a couple of other movies and kind of Civil War subjects. What would it be? Negroes to Hire would be like what it'd be like to be a slave in Missouri, and freedom seekers, stories from the Western Underground Railroad. Written a couple of young adult fiction companion books to those pieces, and about the Underground Railroad out here in Missouri and Kansas. Mm-hmm. And then I did Gangland Wire, and I don't know, I guess I was just looking for something to do. I had a website already for Gangland Wire. Just my wife could do websites, and she made me a website. I tell you what, Jacob, I was listening to a podcast. You start hearing about this podcast thing, and so I'm interested, and I listened to Serial. It's one of the early ones, and I'm listening to it, and it's, man, this is great. This is cool. I really like the podcast. And then I thought, well, they're just telling stories. And I was going around by that point in time. I had to promote my movie. You budding documentary filmmakers out there, it's really hard to make any money. I've been blessed to pretty well break even on everything I've done, but you only do it by going out and promoting it. And how you promote it is you go to any group that'll have you and talk about your subject. There's a ton of groups out there. They don't pay. Mostly they don't pay anything. Rotary Club and all kinds of service organizations and churches and that. So I'd been doing these programs and talking about, my experiences in the mob and showing clips from the movie or maybe showing the whole movie and at a library, and then taking questions and talking afterwards. And I kind of noticed that people, they seem to like to listen to me talk. Now, I never thought about that before, but it seemed like they do. I've noticed they were just real quiet and nobody was getting up to leave. And so I thought, well, maybe I have a little bit of skill here. Then I listened to this podcast and I thought, man, well, how do you make a podcast? I could tell some of my own personal stories. And then, I didn't really know how far I was going to go. Thought I'd at least do that. And I knew this guy that had a little internet radio show. And I got a hold of him. He said, well, yeah, we can come down and record that. And so I went down and recorded a bunch of what I just said and more in more detail and several episodes and threw them up there. And, seemed okay, and it was fun. I liked doing it. And, I was practicing law, but it's the highest paying part-time job I ever had, which is what I kind of wanted out of it. I never wanted to go into it hammer and tong. I don't know. It was just, it never really, it was okay. I liked helping people, but it's extremely hard. And it's, you got to work at getting paid all the time. And
Mm-hmm.
I was never that comfortable. I'm more comfortable working for the government, I guess. And so I go into this, and so I do the podcast, and I've got time, and I go research. I'll go research another story. And then I figured out you could call people up that had a book and get them on the phone, and had rudimentary kind of ways to tape a call. That's what I used. And then this guy could tape calls a little bit. It was always dicey. That he was not rigged very well for taping calls, but I'd tape these guys, and we'd do a show and tape them. And next thing I know, I've got 50 or 60 episodes in. I'm getting a little bit of a following, and people are commenting and getting some feedback, and a few people like it, and I'm getting building more episodes or listening to. Got those analytics and more and more. And so I just kept it up, and I split ways with him and just do it out of my house now. So, all you really need is a decent microphone and a computer. You're in business.
These days.
The entry level is low, and now I'm on YouTube. I didn't used to even mess with YouTube, but now I even put it on YouTube.
I would say 80 to 90% of my audience is on YouTube. So YouTube is it's a critical component, but it's also the thing that takes me the longest, because I'm very particular about the my editing approach and dubbing in pictures and things of that nature. Yeah. And I'm terrible in front of a camera, so I'm always cutting out my mistakes. And as I've gotten,
you can cover yourself up with a picture. And some
stuff. Believe me, I do that. And what I've been doing this year, getting more into interviews, and I plan to do that, because just as you said, there's no shortage of people to talk to that have stories. And quite frankly, the thing that has surprised me most is most people are like, if you just ask them, they'll say yes to coming on your show. That's exactly how you came on my show. I reached out and said, hey, I'm changing the name of my podcast. It's a little bit similar to your podcast. I don't mean any offense. I hope you don't mind. And by the way, I would love to have you on my show as a longtime listener. And it just, it worked out. But yeah, it's the barrier to entry for podcasting is so low right now. There are platforms that are just so tailor-made that make it so easy. And all you have to do is computer, decent microphone setup, and if you're feeling like frisky, if you want to work on your background for YouTube, that's not that hard either. You can buy most of the stuff on Amazon, and what people don't see outside my background is just the pure chaos going around, going on around me, but the background looks good. But yeah, it's been fun, and you've been doing it for 10 years. I can only hope to to do it for that long and pump out as many episodes as you have. What has been either your favorite guest or your favorite episode that you've worked on?
Wow. I don't know. I've had a lot.
Tough question with that much content.
Yeah. A lot of fun guests. I'm trying to think of, and this isn't a famous guy, but I started working with this guy named Cam Robinson, and
Camulus.
It was really fun. Camulus Robinson and Camillus. I don't know how you pronounce it. I pronounce it. I finally said, "Can I call you Cam?" He said, "Yeah," and he was a lot of fun to work with. I haven't done anything.
He just wrote a book.
So, yeah, he wrote that book with the wife of Frank Calabrese Jr. He was a Chicago. What was her name? A Swan Song, a Chicago mob wife story. Lisa Swan, and so I interviewed them, of course, and so so I'm trying to think of mob guys that I've interviewed that were a lot of fun. Oh God, I know there's somebody out there. Oh, Sal Polisi, I love Sal Polisi. I still talk to him every once in a while.
Yeah.
he's a good guy. He's
He's
gone another. He got kind of tied in with a guy wanted to have him like be on there all the time, and I don't really want a mob guy to be my co-host. I mean, no offense, Saul, but I just don't want that. You know, I'm a policeman. I'm the only policeman that has a podcast. I'm the only law enforcement that has a mob podcast. There's an FBI lady that has an FBI podcast, and there's some other true crime things that have some law enforcement people on them. I'm the only law enforcement guy in the mob genre, and I'm going to keep it that way. But I really like Sal, and I talk to him every once in a while today.
He's got some good
stories.
More
favorite podcast, yeah.
Yeah, and he's a great he's a really good storyteller too. He's been featured on documentaries. The only thing I ever question about not just Sal but other people who were in the life, who are informants, who are now out of the life, are just the validity of some of the stories, and just are they embellishing, are they not? And I think that's part of the fun of it. But
you
Sal
never let the facts get in the way of a good story, Jacob.
Right.
You got a lot to learn, man.
I know. You're right. This is entertainment. Nobody cares about the facts.
You have to stick pretty close to the facts. But if it's your personal memoir, then you might drift off a little bit. I don't know. I don't really care. And to me, it's just fun. Nobody's footnoting to this work. There's no academic papers that are going to be written out of this podcast. So,
yeah, I'll tell you, I don't know if you get this. One of the biggest things since the outset of the podcast, points of feedback that I've gotten, and I've gotten so much better, but pronunciation, the pronunciation police come out in full force anytime I make an error. And I did make one error in my Raymond Patriarcha, and I'll explain that in a minute, my Patriarcha episode. So there's a city in Massachusetts that is pronounced Worcester, some variation of that. But it's spelled Worcester, Worcester. It's spelled Worcester.
I didn't know that.
99% of the country, you would read it phonetically as Worcester, and I did that. And it was in like the first 3 minutes of part one of my Patriarcha episode. And within a couple of minutes of posting it, it was immediately comment after comment after comment going, it's Worcester, you idiot. And
well, that's good. That means a lot of people are listening.
That one was a big mistake. So I've had to, like, you know, if I leave the video up, I just have to own up to the fact that was definitely a mistake. But there are people that are so particular. And I hear Patriarcha. I hear lots of people say Raymond Patriarcha, pay. And I have so many people that are like, it's not pay, it's Patriarcha. And I'm like, really? Like that, out of all the content I'm producing, and I love that people are listening and are interested and really passionate, but that's the thing you focus on. And again, I'm not trying to like put down my audience. I'm building a small following myself, and they're very passionate and very particular about their pronunciation. So I'm just trying to keep up. I don't know if you ever get that or not.
Oh God, I just have had two recently. One was Bobby. I said DeCiccio, he was Gambino's. He was Gotti's underboss that got blown up as DeChico. DeChico, and then I did. Oh God, I just had it on the top of my tongue. I did DeChico and. God, I just slipped my mind, but I did another one just here. Napolitano, Sonny Black. It's Napolitano. They don't pronounce the I. The I is not pronounced according to the guy that's married to his cousin, and somebody else mentioned it. I pronounced it wrong. Napolitano.
Yeah.
It's not. You don't pronounce that I. Not Napolitano. It's Napolitano.
Wow. Then that means
it's almost said like one syllable. One guy said, I've never heard that name pronounced in 3 syllables before. Of course, I'm a little more Southern. I might draw something out. But so Napolitano.
That means 99.9% of content creators out there are mispronouncing it. So likely, I always find it interesting. So it's just funny stuff that you don't expect to run into when you're producing a podcast. And I guess I should have expected it, but myself coming from Midwest and quite honestly, like not having grown up anywhere near Italians in any way, shape, or form, and never having to say anything but very plain names coming into this genre. And you've got very creative names, multiple syllables. It took a while to like just get used to saying it, and it took practice. So I'm sure that sounds really, really awful, but it is true. So anyways,
it is.
So Gary, I want to thank you for coming on.
Okay, Jacob.
Amazing stories, your life. Although again, I'll just say you downplay it. Incredibly interesting. You're incredibly accomplished, and I was very excited to get a chance to speak to you and get to know you. So thank you so much for coming on my show.
Well, thank you, Jacob. Thanks for having me on.
And everybody else out there, if you're still listening in, I really appreciate it. Don't forget, as I always say, to like, subscribe, turn on the bell, get notifications, share the episode wherever you can. And then, of course, as soon as you're done watching this, if you haven't already listened to Gary's podcast, please go over to Gangland Wire. I'm going to drop the link to his documentary, Brothers Against Brothers, on Amazon in the description of this video. So please go check it out, go rent it, go buy it. And yeah, share Gary's work and go follow him. He's got a Facebook page we didn't talk about. It's got 50,000 members that post really amazing historical mob photos almost daily. So please go check that out. But as I end every episode, grazie.
Thank you for listening to the Gangland History Podcast. If you'd like to donate to the show, check out our Patreon channel. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe to help the channel grow. If you're an audio-only listener, subscribe via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Until next time, don't forget to keep your mouth shut.